Hey internets, so in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's unfortunate assassination, the discussion has now shifted to a few different talking points as people kind of are still stuck processing just what happened and what it means. And the talking points I'm seeing are, first off, this additional bizarre set of arguments that are trying to claim that Tyler Robinson was some far-right groyper. The second I'm seeing is this extremely bad data cherry-picking combined with studies that utilize nonsense methodology being used to claim that political violence solely comes from the right, with a few also claiming that it solely comes from the left. And lastly, third, this discussion has kind of shifted to being about free speech and this state of hypocrisy, where Republicans and Democrats will pretend to support free speech on principle, but they don't actually believe it on principle. They only believe it when they are not the dominant political party, and then they suddenly stop believing about it and forget about it once they are in power again. So very cringe indeed. Now, originally I was going to go over some of these topics as separate videos this month, but then my illness kind of flared up, and that's why it's been longer than usual since I posted a new video. But on the bright side, as I was stuck just lying around with nothing to do but thinking, I realized that all three of these subjects are much more strongly interconnected than most people realize, and actually would be better off as a single video going over the general problem of motivated reasoning that these talking points all share. But first of all, this video is sponsored by private internet access. In the digital age, everyone needs security and privacy. Even if you think you are doing nothing wrong, that will not stop bad actors from stealing your data and using it to take advantage of you. This is why having a VPN is a necessity. Whether it's from hackers, the surveillance state, or copyright trolls or whoever, private internet access keeps your data safe by using no-log servers with state-of-the-art encryption so that outside observers can no longer spy on you. Their app is also extremely easy to use, and they have an excellent selection of high-speed servers to choose from, which means that in addition to being great for security, this also makes it an excellent VPN for streaming services. Whether you're using Amazon Prime, Netflix, HBO Max, Hulu, or whatever, these services have an irritating habit of superficially limiting your choices of what you can watch based on your country. And by using private internet access, you can use their app to change your IP, which enables you to then watch those things that are available in different countries. Or at the very least, it's a heck of a lot less expensive than flying to them or really any of the alternatives. Because another awesome thing about them is that private internet access is an extremely affordable VPN. And if you use my personal link in the description below, you can get it for 83% off at only $2.03 per month and with 4 months free, covered with a risk-free 30-day money-back guarantee. Anyways, let's start out with the first of these, which is additional silly claims that Tyler Robinson was somehow a rightoid or some kind of groyper who was trying to pull off some kind of false flag operation. And this one is, of course, by far the easiest of the three to refute. But you will want to pay very close attention to some of the backwards reasoning that some of the people use to try and claim that he was a rightoid when we get to the bad faith data analysis. Because, spoiler alert, there are some similarities, but other than that, this one's pretty straightforward. I mean, even very left-wing journalists from Vox admit that it is very, very unlikely that Tyler Robinson is a rightoid. Because since my last video, a lot more information has come to light, and with that information comes a lot more bad takes. Which does also come with the temptation to just kind of ignore it and just again say that, hey, any reasonable adult can just denounce political violence from all sides. Again, it is not hard at all if you have a consistent moral philosophy to say, hey, murdering someone for something that they said is a very wrong thing to do, whether it's coming from the left or the right, and just leave it at that. However, I'm going to refute this anyway because I've noticed that this attempt to paint Tyler Robinson as right-wing is really just an attempt by the far left to downplay the issue and pretend like it doesn't matter, which aside from just being obviously intellectually dishonest is also very irresponsible. And you may wonder, how successful have they been at convincing people that Tyler Robinson was a rightoid? Well, if you look at this YouGov survey, apparently they've been actually quite successful, at least from September 12th to 15th. Maybe people have gained a bit more of a head on their shoulders on this, but it really does show just how well the propaganda wagon has worked, with only 32% of independents recognizing that the ideology behind Tyler Robinson was left-wing beliefs. Again, that's independents, which means that the poor normies have once again been successfully gaslit, because all of these attempts to paint Tyler Robinson as right-wing are based on this one type of flawed reasoning, which is thinking that all evidence is equal, thinking that you can just tally up things of, oh, this is a thing that Tyler Robinson did that suggests right-leaning beliefs, and oh, this is a thing that Tyler Robinson did that suggests left-leaning beliefs, and if we can just find more things to tally up that say that he had right-wing beliefs, then that makes him a right-winger. Well, no, because the quality quality of these things matters a lot more. There is such a thing as weak evidence and strong evidence for a certain position. So for example, one bad take I've seen is that some Redditoids have tried to claim that, oh, he was a groiper because groipers might partake in a false flag operation, or a groiper might do the strategy of acceleration. And of course, from that reasoning, they then argue that Tyler Robinson must be an accelerationist. And well, no, that's not actually correct. Simply proving that a possibility exists doesn't mean you've proven the thing that you're claiming to be true. And this is just honestly kind of basic reasoning, basic Occam's razor here. You have to also consider how likely that probability is. And one simple way to see that that probability is very low is just realizing that based on this reasoning, everyone can be claimed to be a groiper. It's a completely unfalsifiable claim. Like, for example, is it possible that Vladimir Putin is an alien? Well, technically, yes, it is, but only because it's almost completely impossible to completely rule that out. The actual chances that he's an alien are very, very, very comically low. It's just a crackpot making a random unfalsifiable claim. Because you can't prove that he isn't an alien doesn't mean that he is an alien. Same problem here, just because we can't prove that he isn't a groiper trying to pull a false flag for accelerationist reasons, well, that doesn't prove that he is. That's not how the burden of proof works. That's not how honest reasoning works. That's just silly straw grasping. And of course, the time frame matters a lot more. For example, one of the things I covered in my previous video was the cope of, oh, he dressed up as Donald Trump back when he was a kid, therefore he must be a conservative, in contrast with evidence of him being left-wing, such as left-wing slogans being written on his ammo during the time of the shooting. And of course, the obvious issue with trying to look at those as equal pieces of evidence is they are completely ignoring the time element. Because what Tyler Robinson believed at the time of the shooting probably had a lot more influence on what his motive for the shooting was than what he believed when he was a kid. And that's just kind of an obvious qualitative factor that I'm seeing a lot of this midwittery just kind of deliberately ignore. Just the obvious difference in quality of evidence and weight of evidence. Like, for example, if you're going to the grocery store, your incentive behind what you're going to buy at the grocery store is probably more influenced on the grocery store list that you wrote roughly 3 hours before going to the grocery store than it is influenced by whatever video game you decided to play back 7 years ago or so on some random rainy night where you weren't even thinking about groceries. It's actually kind of weird to me that I need to point this obvious fact out. It is a very well-known fact of psychology that a person's actions are more motivated by their thoughts at the time of the action than being motivated by whatever their thoughts were at some random arbitrarily chosen point in time in the past 5 to 10 years ago or whatever. So same problem, they're making no attempt whatsoever to discern strong evidence from weak evidence. When it comes to a qualitative factor like incentives and human action, evidence regarding what their beliefs and incentives were at the time of the action is multiple orders of magnitude stronger evidence for whatever their motivation was behind that action than some random crap that they were thinking about one afternoon back when they were in junior high school or whatever. And so it's very irrational to try and present something like that as some kind of counter evidence. It's not. It's very stupid. And then the same silly reasoning is put into the whole claim of, oh, look, he seems to have liked guns, therefore he was a right-winger. For example, I still see some people using Adam Cochran's debunked posts where he says, oh, he used to go shooting and hunting and fishing with his father, therefore he's a right-winger. Which of course is ridiculous. I mean, first of all, it's not even a partisan thing. You can go hunting, shooting, fishing, or whatever, and still be either politically neutral, or you can even be left-wing and do those things. That's not necessarily a political activity. I mean, sure, on average, the people who tend to enjoy doing those things tend to be more likely to be Republican, but the actual activity itself is apolitical. And of course, it also just commits the error in reasoning I just mentioned. It does not matter that he used to go hunting and fishing as a kid, because his thoughts around the time that he went hunting and fishing as a kid, that probably happened anywhere from 8 to 15 years before the actual shooting of Charlie Kirk occurred, probably were not the same thoughts that he had banging around inside his noggin at the time of him committing his crime. That's what I mean. It's just honestly a very weird argument to make. Another one I see is people have found out that his parents, Matthew Carl Robinson and Amber Denise Robinson, are registered Republicans, and then they claim that, oh, therefore he must be a Republican. It's just association. It doesn't actually prove anything about what he believed. In fact, this seems to be the new cope in lieu of a certain thing being debunked, which is the claim that Tyler Robinson himself was a registered Republican, which was actually just proven to be outright false. And so now things are shifted to like, oh, well, his parents are, therefore he must be, which actually proves very little. I mean, just statistics that show you political leanings by age category should show you that young people don't necessarily believe the same thing as their parents. That's just kind of an obvious thing you can point to that disproves that narrative right off the bat. But also it ignores another kind of obvious issue, which which is the fact that difference in political views may have actually contributed to this attack. Because if Tyler Robinson's parents were very conservative and he was very left-leaning, then well, that would have driven a wedge between him and his family. And that would lead to resentment and loneliness and ostracization, which would of course be additional psychological factors behind why Tyler Robinson would commit such a horrible crime, which is just another basic, relatively well-known statistic. It has been shown many times that most convicted felons have some kind of family issues going on. So TLDR, the beliefs of his family proves nothing. Another weird cope is people still fixating on the fact that he was wearing a shirt that had an American flag. I kinda already went over this one again in my previous video. Wearing an American flag doesn't actually prove anything about one's political beliefs, but I still see this cope being thrown around a lot. And I think people are ignoring an obvious counter reason, which is that what a person wears during the time that they plan to commit a crime actually proves very little. So I mean, let's just pretend that wearing an American flag does in fact imply that you must be a right-winger. Again, it does not prove that, but for the sake of argument, let's pretend, let's live in a fantasy world where it does. Okay, but during a crime does it prove that? Because the incentive when you are committing a crime, if you want to get away with that crime, which the fact that he hid from authorities for several days proves that Tyler Robinson absolutely wanted to get away with it, well, what you're wearing just shows what you want to wear to try and fit in. So him wearing an American flag is just a way for him to go incognito. And the fact that he was wearing a hat along with some sunglasses to, further obfuscate his identity just further proves this. It's the same reason bank robbers tend to wear a mask instead of just going in there with their face showing. I mean, just imagine trying to make this exact same argument under that context. Oh, the bank robber was wearing a gorilla mask when he was doing his bank robbery, therefore the bank robber must secretly want to be a monkey. I mean, that's just kind of the low level of intuition we're dealing with here. But anyway, the point here I'm trying to make is that all of the arguments for Tyler Robinson being a right-winger are just ignoring the obvious issue of that there being such a thing as a difference between strong evidence and weak evidence. So what we're seeing here is kind of a different form of the midwit nitpick fallacy, where pseudo-intellectuals think that if they can just find enough tiny problems wrong with a thing, then that disproves the thing. And well, no, that's not how reasoning works. A bunch of things that have less than 1% chance of actually being true, and only because they're completely unfalsifiable, well, all those little pebbles do not add up to a good argument. Simply pointing out how it's possible that he could be a groyper based on just random conjecture doesn't prove that he is. And then of course you have the standard mainstream media sleight of hand lies, like this one from NBC. No evidence found yet of ties between Charlie Kirk's shooting and left-wing groups. Okay, well, but that's not the same thing as his motives behind the attack. Simply not having tie to a specific left-wing group does not disprove left-wing beliefs. That is not even close to being the same thing. It is, again, just another nitpick. It is just more pedantically correct. It does not matter. Which then brings us to the next subject, which is people shifting the discussion away from Tyler Robinson to a more general claim where they're using very bad data cherry picking combined with some very bad studies to try and claim that political violence solely comes from the right. But I've also seen a few people use some cherry picking to claim that it solely comes from the left, which honestly isn't true either. But the key issue here is that on a lot of these studies, the issue with their methodology is exactly the same issue as what I just went over with in terms of understanding why Tyler Robinson was most likely a left-winger. Because all of these studies that I've looked at commit the intellectual dishonesty sin of allowing very weak evidence to be used for saying that a incident was from the right, but demanding very strong evidence in order to say that an incident came from the left. And immediately the rational temptation here is to just say that violence should be denounced from all sides. It doesn't matter who's doing it, it's bad either way. I'd like to still think that any rational, reasonable adult can just leave it at that. However, I've decided to go over these studies anyway because they're very bad, and thus they provide a very good example of why the saying goes that there are lies, damned lies, and then there's statistics. It's very easy to control for or add additional factors into your sample size in order to get statistics to say whatever you want them to say. And it's especially bad when it comes to politics and philosophy because a lot of times people will have ideologically motivated reasons to basically lie. And this is especially true when you get down to vague discussions of right versus left. Because let's be honest, the political compass is a lot more complicated than that. And so before getting into the examples I'd like to cover, I'll just go over some general immediate problems you're going to run into when you try and get a study to say something like this. First off, you have the issue of politically motivated murder versus politically motivated violence. And depending on which you're covering, well, that's just going to exclude a lot of data that really shouldn't be excluded. did. With one particular pattern I noticed is that all the studies that tried to claim that it was the left that was less violent, well, they all just conveniently tried to hyper-focus on fatalities only, while ignoring greater property crimes and general political unrest. Gee, I wonder why they would do that. The reason behind that just completely eludes me. Okay, seriously though, unfortunately, I wish I was joking here. Yes, a lot of these statistics completely ignore things like Antifa and BLM riots. Because, when they include that data, it doesn't give them the answer that they want. And then on top of that, you have just a general poor understanding of what constitutes right-wing or left-wing. For example, one of the studies I saw included things like incel ideology into right-wing political violence, which if you actually look into the incel community, you'll realize that they're actually more centrist, or in terms of economics, most of them are actually pretty left-leaning. So that's just another basic example of poor methodology. But it also highlights the issue here, where in a lot of these studies, you're going to see the same arguments as the arguments for Tyler Robinson not being left-wing. It's kind of a garbage in, garbage out issue. If your data set doesn't give a fair distinction between what is left and what is right, and what is strong evidence and what is weak evidence, well then you're going to end up with some amazingly meaningless data. Another problem is that a lot of these studies don't really account for things like investigation and reporting bias. And what I mean by this are things like just because journalists report on topic X, that doesn't necessarily mean that topic X actually happens more often. But I've seen some of these statistics not really take that into account, and they just assume that, oh hey, journalists are more likely to report on right-wing violence, therefore that type of violence is more likely to happen. Which of course is completely invalid methodology. It doesn't account for the possibility that journalists just over-report on things that agree with their ideology. And another particularly malicious issue I spotted was that some of these studies will actually give completely different rules to what is right-wing and what is left-wing. Such as with my earlier example with BLM riots not being counted, some of these studies will actually count the January 6th Capitol riot, but then not count the BLM and Antifa riots. Or another one is they'll count civil rights crimes against minorities as quote-unquote right-wing, which honestly ethno-nationalism, if you understand it, is more of a centrist authoritarian thing, not really right-wing, but I'll give it that one simply because that's how most people think of it, unfortunately. But then they won't treat crimes against white people in the same manner, and they won't count that as left-wing violence. So that's another big issue where some of these studies just intentionally do not apply the same logic to both sides, which is, just pretty blatantly deceptive. And also, to be fair here, I did see a little bit of deception coming from the right as well. So for example, I saw one conservative counter-study where they tried to claim that the left is way more violent based on the fact that convicts in the United States are more likely to vote for the Democrats than they are for the Republicans. And the problem with that is it's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum of cooking the data. There's most of the time two ways to cook data and statistics to make them say what you want them to say. And that's to either increase the sample size in a way that doesn't make sense by making it way too broad, or by reducing the sample size to make it unrealistically small, and then editing your methodology either way. There are other ways to cook statistics, but most of the time when I see cooked data, it's someone engaging in one or the other. They're either including things into their sample that don't make sense for them to include, or they're excluding things into their sample that they should be including, depending on what they want the data to say. So they're just looking for data to support their conclusion, and then they publish that. And that's just kind of the basic reason why it's entirely rational to be skeptical of empirical data. And since the entire point of the discussion is in relation to what happened to Charlie Kirk, well, it doesn't really make sense to extend that to all convicts and just say, oh, they're more left-leaning, and therefore the left is more violent, because that doesn't really tell you anything in regards to their motive. Because what makes Charlie Kirk's assassination mean what it means is, of course, the motive. If he had just gotten robbed and murdered by some street thug stealing his wallet, well, that would still suck, and it would still be evil, and it would still be a tragedy, but then obviously that wouldn't have the same meaning behind it in comparison to Tyler Robinson's motives. And so I believe the reasonable set here, if we want to be honest and fair and compare apples to apples, is to make sure you're focusing only on incidents that have some kind of political motive. But that's also kind of where you run into problems. To show you what I mean, let's dive into some actual examples now, starting with this one, which is this study by Reuters: ideology behind 18 fatal political attacks identified by Reuters since the Capitol riot. Right-wing 13, not tied to partisan US politics 4, left-wing 1. So this one, right off the bat, is just kind of an obvious example of very low sample size, which gives a dead giveaway that what they define as quote-unquote a political attack has probably been severely stripped down. Low sample sizes generally either indicate a lazy study or a study with a very unreasonable methodology. Or in this case, just being blatantly dishonest, because the study seems to be from August 2023, and so they're only really going over 2 years here. So that's a very narrow window. It's also a very suspicious window because the year before that, in 2020, we had something around 36 murders that could have been attributed to BLM. And yet they strangely start their study on the January 6th Capitol riot, simply simply so they don't have to count that. So that's another way to spot bad data, when it hyper-focuses on a very narrow date range, and there's no real reason given why they would do that. So arbitrarily small sample size and arbitrarily small date range, that's two very big red flags before you even look at the data. But even within that window, the only left-wing case they identified was Robert Tell's. So that immediately tells you quite a lot. First off, the obvious issue is they're only looking at fatalities and not all property crimes, which doesn't really make much sense because it's absolutely possible for someone to destroy general property while having a political motivation behind that crime. That's again my biggest contention here. Yes, fatalities are worse than no fatalities, but property crimes in general, like burning someone's business down, well, that's still bad. It's still gonna ruin someone's life, and it's still arguably political terrorism. But it's also not even correct because there were about 5 verified fatalities during these events during this time period. The catch, however, is that they don't really exhaustively investigate the motivations behind those fatalities in these events. And so there's a tendency by the people going over this data to give good faith to the rioters and assume that anybody who did anything wrong during the riot did not share in any ideology, as well as just other general weird excuses, again similar to the weird excuses given for why Tyler Robinson wasn't left-wing. And this is so common that I can even just think of one example off the top of my head. The Manuel Terán incident, or Tortuguita as he is called. Now, this guy was killed by cops. However, the reason he was is because he shot at them first. He was angry that the officers were physically removing their encampment because, they were occupying land that they didn't actually own. And so instead of leaving, he took out a handgun and fired 4 shots at the officers and even hit one of them. And so naturally they fired back. Now, rightfully, in a case like this, it should be considered left-wing violence, even though it was his own death, because he was the one who escalated the aggressive conflict into that of a fatal conflict. But these studies don't count it. And so I decided to ask Grok about left-wing fatalities during protests and riots from January 2021 to August 2023. And what Grok claims is that there were 0 confirmed fatalities. Now, of course, Grok is not actually correct here. When you read deeper, you just see excuses for why the fatalities that happened at these incidents were not as a result of left-wing ideology. And just like there's weird excuses for the Tortuguita incident, there are, of course, on an individual case-by-case basis, very weird excuses for each of those incidents. And so when you really start to look at this data, you realize that these studies don't actually show that the right is more politically violent. What they actually show is a systemic issue where journalists and investigators try to defend left-wing violence and do not count left-wing violence by not counting any violence as left-wing. A more common study that was being thrown around was one done by the Cato Institute, which is very unfortunate because Cato usually publishes good data, but in this instance they failed. This one was debunked at length by the Substack of Jennifer42, and the whole thing can really be summarized by this statement right here. As is the way with these pieces, a ham-fisted attempt was made to justify the exclusion of a great many acts of violence from the political left, while including many absolute absurdities in the right-wing column. And then the article just goes at length into many examples of this miscategorization. And then another example is the ADL study, which was used as the source for a lot of the mainstream media articles about this issue. And yet when you look into it, it too also has pretty much the exact same type of methodological errors, classifying things like prison gang violence or anti-government extremism as quote-unquote right-wing. It's also another one of the studies like the one I mentioned earlier that is clearly excluding a very big thing from their data. I wonder what it is they could be excluding here based on their claims that 2020 was one of the most peaceful years on record. I just can't put my finger on what they might be excluding from this data. It's just somehow completely escaping me. And then of course it excludes a lot of left-wing violence for really weird reasons. Like, for instance, saying that the Luigi Mangione incident doesn't count as left-wing violence because it's not part of left-wing ideology. He just didn't like the healthcare system. That's politically neutral. But if you then look this up, if you ask Google or something, was Luigi Mangione a leftist, you'll find similar avoidant reasons. Various excuses to not look at it as an incident of left-wing violence, even though the ideology behind it is heavily supported by many leftists. And of course, same problem. Doesn't count riots, doesn't count general political unrest caused by them, makes excuses for them, and only counts left-wing political violence as left-wing if there's overwhelming evidence for it, while accepting even the tiniest, weakest bit of evidence for classifying it as right-wing. So once again, we see very obviously cooked data here. And really, in my opinion, I don't think it's really possible to get good data on this, because what we're really seeing in all of these studies is that the idea of quote-unquote political violence is very poorly defined. And again, there's no real reason to expect that the people investigating the motives motives behind the violence are interested in labeling it as such. And so I believe a better way to look at it is to see how people think about political violence. Like, for example, this one right here, acceptability of being happy about an opponent's death. The people who think it's always or usually acceptable are mostly on the far left, and the people who say it's always or usually unacceptable are mostly people on the far right. Now, admittedly, this study was done on September 11, 2025, so it can be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt here. And of course, most people on the far left say that it is usually unacceptable. So there's some silver lining there, because it shows that most people are in fact reasonable about this sort of thing. But again, this kind of thing does call into question whether it's really the right that is entirely at fault for political violence, because based on people's beliefs, it's clearly not. And then there's another study that kind of looks at this from a rhetorical perspective, like this one right here. Strong liberals say it's morally acceptable to punch Nazis. And this, of course, is in relation to the typical far left scam rhetoric, where they will basically get away with calling for political violence on a lot of big tech platforms and remain fully monetized unlike right-wing channels, because they advocate for their violence in 2 steps, in a very nice and coordinated Mott and Bailey dance. They will first give reasons for why it is morally justifiable to punch Nazis and fascists and whatever, and of course those justifications are what happened in mid-1900s Germany, but then they will falsely accuse everyone to the right of Obama of being a Nazi or fascist, including libertarians like myself, who strongly oppose pretty much everything mid-1900s Germany ever did. And of course, when you call them out on this, they will retreat to the Mott and pretend like they don't know exactly what they're doing with this kind of rhetoric. Which then brings me to the final topic, which is that the whole incident, the whole shebang, has also kind of reignited the age-old discussion of free speech. And on this incident, I can absolutely understand where the Republicans are coming from. Yes, Jimmy Kimmel is a very stereotypical example of an annoying lefty midwit. He is absolutely one of those people where just about everything that comes out of his mouth is at best pedantically correct, and usually just flat out wrong. And so to that degree, his firing can just be seen as an example of physical removal. And of course, lefties whining about it comes across as obviously deeply unserious, because a lot of them are the exact same people who were praising big tech censorship of the right from roughly 2017 to 2024, honestly still to today, because they're still doing it, just in case you didn't know that. But anyways, it can definitely be seen as a classic case of people being insincere. Democrats supporting censorship when their preferred party is in power, and then suddenly being against censorship when their party is not in power, or Republicans doing the same thing. It's pretty easy to look at this and just say it's hypocrisy and move on. But I think there's a lot more to it than that, because in my opinion, being a imagine if the roles are reversed cuck is not a good thing to be. Knowing the history of the Republican and Democratic Party, I sincerely doubt that whether or not the Republicans are censoring left-wingers online is going to have any impact on whether or not Democrats will do the same thing once they're back in power. I mean, let's just be honest, they're probably going to do it again anyway, no matter what. And so on that note, I'd like to once again point out the libertarian principled position on this, which is that physical removal from a private property standpoint is really the true sensible take on freedom of speech. Speech is not a reason to go out and murder somebody. That's just pretty much always wrong. Unless they're using speech to directly threaten aggression, you can't really make a very good argument against freedom of speech. However, you can make an argument for why you don't want a person saying certain things on your own property. Someone being kicked out of a party, for instance, for saying some stupid stuff that they probably shouldn't have said, well, that's just property rights being taken to their logical conclusion. And so thus, the principal position on the whole Jimmy Kimmel thing is that the FCC should be abolished. Jimmy Kimmel being fired from a private business for saying stupid crap is perfectly fine. But of course, the mainstream media isn't really a private organization. It's kind of private in name only due to how much government involvement is with these corporations and how much government regulation is involved. And so the correct answer is thus that all of the government involvement should be removed. Scrap all of the subsidies, privatize any necessary functions of the FCC, and then get rid of all the rest. And those of us on the libertarian right have recently been vindicated on this statement, because it's been proven that a lot of the big tech censorship that took place in previous years, like that on Facebook and Google, was in fact just government agents screaming to have their way. And so that's what really needs to happen. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to agree with any kind of online censorship or agree with when private companies that are very large decide to censor some somebody. You can absolutely criticize them on that, because believing in someone's right to do a thing doesn't necessarily mean you believe that that is a good thing for them to do, but it's important for people to understand that the government involvement in this has been proven to be the main culprit behind all of the problems. And that's also how I know how a lot of the complaints coming from the Democrats on this issue are completely insincere. Because are any of them calling for the abolition of the FCC or anything like that? No! They're just completely reversing on the "it's a private platform" argument. They don't want to get rid of any of the government power structures or bureaucracy at the heart of the problem. And so that's how you know that it is once again an example of the grift of them pretending to be libertarians and pretending to have libertarian views that they obviously do not actually believe. None of them want the FCC to be dismantled, they're just mad that it's Trump's administration that is currently in charge of it. That's all. That's how you know they don't actually believe it. And that's why their whining should not be taken seriously. Anyways, that's all I have to say on this subject. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and if you want to support my content, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch. Of which the Ron Paul merch sale is still going, mainly because I just haven't been feeling good enough to change it. But anyways, again, thanks for watching. That is all. Till next time.